Welcome to Interpreters and Interrupters. Today's guest is Razan Roumany. She is an Arabic and Spanish medical and conference interpreter. Today, we'll be talking about medical, legal, and conference interpreting. Welcome to the show, Razan.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure's mine.
Let's start by you telling us about yourself.
Sure. My name is Razan Roumany. I am a conference and medical interpreter. I started training back in 2020, peak pandemic. I did my master's degree in interpretation and translation studies. I graduated in 2022, and I've been working ever since.
When I was growing up, it was my grandfather that prompted me to be an interpreter. I was 8, and he just said to me one day out of the blue, "When you grow up, you should be an interpreter so you could help our people." I didn't even know what he meant by our people, and I didn't know what an interpreter was. How did you decide to become an interpreter?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that led me to make ultimately the decision I did. I remember back in college, we had a guest speaker come to our university. This individual went blind at 30. She had a diseased retina, unfortunately, and she was looking for purpose in her life. And she found interpreting. She found a job that she didn't necessarily have to see. Now, obviously, as interpreters, we do a lot of note taking. Is it absolutely necessary for our profession? Arguably, no. Is it better? Debatably. But she was able to find another way to do the same thing, essentially. And she ended up becoming an excellent interpreter. She got certified as a court interpreter. And that was really the first time where I realized that interpreting actually is a profession. People train for this. It's not a bilingual person interpreting for a mom in a doctor's appointment. So that essentially, and again, there are a lot of factors, but that is really what lit that spark. I think that's what sparked my interest. Oftentimes, when we think interpreter, people think someone who's bilingual who interprets for their parents, right? That's what the general public thinks. The other day, I was interpreting at a clinic, and the doctor was like, "Oh, so what do you work as?" And I was like, "I'm an interpreter." And she was like, "No, what's your real job? What do you actually do outside of here?" I'm an interpreter. And she was like, the reason why I asked that question was because we have people volunteer and interpret here all the time, which for many reasons is a big waving red flag for me.
After hearing the speaker at your university, how long did it take you to decide that interpreting was going to be your future career?
Oh, it took a good couple years. It was a gradual research. I was still torn between going to medical school. Do I do my master's in linguistics? I was still torn between the two. It was definitely a gradual research.
How did you go about choosing medical interpreting over legal interpreting?
My heart is more on the medical side. I have more of an interest naturally in medicine than the legal stuff. Not that I dislike it. I had a bigger interest in medicine. The legal stuff is just different. Court interpreting is an entirely different animal. It's a different beast than what we do in the medical field. There are a lot of protocols in court. We have a little bit more flexibility in the medical field. In court, if you want to ask for clarification, for example, you have to address yourself in the third person. You can't just ask the client for a petition. You have to take permission from the judge. You address them as Your Honor, the interpreter would like to see clarification. You tell them specifically what you missed. It is just a lot more formal typically. There are a lot of protocols. A lot more people are watching you, so there might be a little bit more of a stage fright. In the medical field, it is a more private environment. But yeah, I just found medicine fascinating, and I ended up choosing it over the legal
And
stuff.
Razan, I've worked as a legal interpreter, and you're absolutely right about the stage fright. The first time I was in court, there were 60 people in the courtroom. 99% of them were Spanish speakers, so I had to interpret for all of them, and I had to do it before noon. More respondents showed up after lunchtime. I actually like it a lot better than medical interpreting, and yet at the same time, medical interpreting is so satisfying. You feel like you're really helping someone. This podcast is called Interpreters and Interrupters. How do you handle interruptions when you're medical interpreting? And it's one of the interruptions that you get is medical staff trying to speak Spanish.
It happens all the time. We have a doctor or a nurse who, let's just say, took Spanish in high school, right? So they sit there and they talk to the patient, for example. And again, this happens so frequently. And they're like, "Tú vamos a hacerle un procedimiento. Entonces, ¿qué medicamentos, as the interpreter, you sit there like, "Oh, I don't wanna seem pretentious and, allow me," but at the same time, you do have to not in a pretentious, egotistical, uh, way, but, I always repeat what they're saying in Spanish, because sometimes I do see the patient struggling to follow along. And so even if the doctor, let's just say they say something in Spanish, I always repeat what they're saying in Spanish. I phrase it different, or I end up saying, "Excuse me," and that usually lets me take over and I go like, "Excuse me," with my notebook, and that has been my strategy for the past 2 or so years.
I'm going to start doing that next week. I'm just going to say, excuse me, because I usually say, please speak only in English so that the interpreter can interpret. And no matter how nicely I say that, people get offended.
They do. I remember the first ever assignment I had, I thought I was being a good interpreter, because when we're trained, when they train us, they train you to say, let's just say the doctor starts directly addressing you. You're trained to say, the interpreter would like for you to directly speak with the patient, please. And I remember saying that actually to a doctor, because he walked in and he looked at me and was like, yeah, where does it hurt him? What happens to be the problem? I pointed to the patient. I was like, if you don't mind, the interpreter would like for you to address the patient correctly. And I got this like offended reaction. I still think about that sometimes. I still think about that, that's a core memory for me. I think about that all the time.
What is it that bothers you about that incident? Are you questioning your decision at the time that you decided to follow the protocol and ask the medical provider to speak directly to the patient? Or do you think you should have just let it go?
Did it come across as, oh no, let me do my job? Did I come across as that like that? I still, I've asked colleagues about this. Why do you think I got that reaction? The best way I found, if you find that the doctor's looking at you and talking to you, even if you're pretending to act like you're writing something down. A lot of colleagues might disagree with me. Sometimes in certain situations, it is okay to sound like the interpreter. Sometimes, when you try to sound a little bit like the interpreter and when you look like you're writing notes down, when you don't make eye contact, it encourages them to look more at the patient. It's kind of you redirecting them without directly saying, hey, this is what you're going to do. And maybe that is why he got offended, is maybe I came across a little, this is what's going to happen. And obviously, that's not what we that's not what we want to do. From what I've found in my personal experience, a lot of the textbook interpreting, a lot of the things they teach you in training, not realistic in real life. It would happen, yes, in a perfect world, in an ideal world, but not realistic all the time.
I interviewed my friend Jordana, an American Sign Language interpreter. I interviewed her in season 1. And whenever I ask her a question about interpreting, she's always like, well, it depends.
Yeah. Every time you ask a translator a question, they're like, it depends on the context. That is their famous phrase, right? And interpreting, ethically, it's a phrase I can't say enough. It depends on the situation. And I tell my colleagues, you have to use your common sense and use your best judgment at that point in time.
Yeah, that's right. Now, you work as a medical interpreter, but you also work as a conference interpreter. Can you tell me more about that? Conference interpreting?
When I was doing my master's, I did the conference interpreting track, and I loved it. Unlike translation and interpretation, when the assignment's done, it's done. Obviously, you still reflect about it. You go, okay, what could I have done better? How could have this gone more, so on and so forth. But in translation, you're never really done. Up until the last moment, you're thinking, do I do this or this? Seen translators on LinkedIn go, oh, so wake up, cold sweat in the middle of the night over a semicolon. You're never satisfied with it because you have not a crazy amount of time to do it, but you have all this time to reflect about it. But the thing I loved about conference interpreting, especially simultaneous, was the fact that I was put under pressure. And, once I made that, what we call utterance, once I said it, once it's gone, it's gone. Right? It's like tennis. My professor always used to say, interpreting is like tennis. You hit, you interpret, and you forget. It's done. So that is a big reason why I got into conference interpreting.
I've been a big admirer of conference interpreters. I mean, their simultaneous rendering is on point each and every time. They don't skip a beat. But when it comes to the topic that is being talked about, how do you go about preparing for that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you have to make the decision, and you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to say, "Do I qualify for this or not? Do I have the linguistic ability or not?" Sure, you can study up and read up on vocabulary. Obviously, none of us are, interpreters. We have a strong general knowledge, but we're not like experts in every field, and we don't know everything, about every subtopic and or anything like that. No, but you do have to make that decision first and foremost. So, for example, if let's just say we have an assignment in a week, you have to be like, okay, is a week enough for me to read up on this topic? Yes or no? You have to be open with the organizers or whoever hired you and say, "Hey, I do need time to prepare. Can you send me any PowerPoints, any resources in advance?" I would go ahead and tell them that. If it's too short of a notice, unrealistic, again, we have to put our ego aside and say, "It's not worth the stress." I know it's exciting, especially when you're starting out and you get that first offer. It is so exciting, and it's hard to say no. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the big picture and say, if I'm in a big meeting and I end up not being able to perform at least decently, it's gonna end up being really embarrassing. It really is, especially when clients come out going, "I have no idea what to I'm still confused." That's very embarrassing, and at the end of the day, it's your reputation, right? Because people recommend interpreters, right? They're like, "Oh, this interpreter is wonderful," or "This interpreter was so unprofessional. They sounded like they didn't really know what they were talking about." You have to make that decision to be realistic.
Your performance is your business card. And don't underestimate the power of word of mouth marketing. I received so many assignments in the past due to word of mouth marketing. People that I worked with or worked for, and they saw my skills, liked what I did, and told others. Now tell me what a day in the life of Razan Roumany, Arabic and Spanish medical and conference interpreter is like.
Every day is so different for me. Like, my day might look like, for example, like, I might have a mental health client in the morning and then be in the OR in the afternoon. I might have a meeting somewhere in between where I'm doing simultaneous for a school meeting, a board meeting. No 2 days are the same ever, which I love.
I know, right? That's the best thing about interpreting. It's like the same, but it's not. You know,
Yeah, yeah. Like, for mental health clients, like, sure, like, you might see, like, a client, like, every Thursday at 1 p.m. So, yeah, sure, you might have somewhat of a routine, but a session with a client might look very different from week to week, especially with child therapy, even with adult therapy. One session might be you walk out laughing. In another session next week, you might walk out crying. It can end up being a really heavy session. Same thing with child therapy. So even that unpredictability of sessions, I'm fortunate enough to never be bored. I'm always on my toes, and that is what I love about my job.
you live in the Midwest, you don't live in a metropolitan city. How difficult is it for you to obtain assignments?
Virtually, it is not too difficult to obtain. In person, it is. As far as I know, we don't really have booths, unfortunately, in the city where I live, as far as I know, anyways. We're conducting more and more meetings online. So calling the interpreters into a physical booth, it happens. Obviously, it still happens, but it is becoming less common, especially after the pandemic. We all know how to use Zoom now, right? So it's becoming a little bit less frequent. I've not had the fortune of stepping inside a real booth yet, but I'm hoping to one day. But I usually, for an online event, I always create glossaries. I always insist on meeting my partner, my booth mate, if you will, my virtual booth mate. I always make a point to speak to them virtually on Zoom, phone call. We go over the material together. You can't just show up that day and, okay, we'll switch every 15 minutes. So the communication with you and your booth partner, it has to be really good. Like in track, you see the athletes pass the baton and it has to be very smooth. You need to communicate. That is very important, the communication between booth mates.
Does the client give you a heads up of what's going to be said, like a PowerPoint presentation or a script?
It depends. Usually I get PowerPoint slides and I highlight challenging terminology. This is why it's also important to talk to your colleagues before the assignments. We need to be consistent with terminology, right? So we go, okay, so what word are we going to use for this? For this challenging word, just so we're not being inconsistent. How would you phrase this? What are you going to use for this complex term? Just so I use the same word, so we're not expressing it in two different ways, just so it's smoother, just so it's a smoother process. But yeah, usually I get PowerPoint notes. if not like a document, like a summary, something that's going to tell me what's going to
Mhm.
happen.
Are there topics that you prefer to work with, or are there topics that you avoid?
Personally, I would avoid things that are like, I don't know, something like engineering, something I know is very specialized, something that I would avoid an assignment that if I look at, the material and I go, okay, 2 to 3 days is nowhere near enough time for me to familiarize myself with this topic. There's no way I can Anki card my way into knowing 200 words in 3 days. When I find it like that, I go ahead and decline. But anything medical, I love to accept any kind of like medical meeting, school meetings. I also do educational interpreting from time to time as well. So things like that. I make sure it's a topic I'm familiar with.
Tell me about your first conferencing interpreting assignment. How did that go?
Oh, goodness. I remember my colleague who is much more experienced than I am. He's been doing this for much longer than I am. He was on the phone and kind of panicked. He's like, "Hey, I'll do this part. I'll do page number 1 and 2. And then, I can text you. We can And I'm sitting there like, okay, please calm down. You're giving me anxiety, man. Just breathe. Let's talk about how, what we call in the remote interpreting world, back channels. I was sitting there, okay, breathe. Why don't we think of how are we gonna communicate remotely, right? Is that WhatsApp, regular messages? Because in the booth, and this is why, and again, I keep saying this over and over, communication is important, right? How do I know when you want me to take over? There is no perfect, "Oh, after 20 minutes." No such thing. You never know. Sometimes it is a relatively easier rendition, and you can push it for a while. It's like running. If you're jogging or walking, you can go for a while, but if it's a sprint, you can only do that for so long. No matter how athletic you are, no matter how talented and great you are, a human being can only physically sprint for so long. Same thing with interpretation. If it's very complex, you can only go for so long. Typically, we say about the 30-minute mark, the quality of the rendition goes down. I read on LinkedIn where it was like after 30 minutes, the quality of the interpretation goes down. After that 30 minutes, the interpreter no longer cares that the quality of the rendition went down.
How do you deal when the speaker or speakers is difficult to understand because you're doing simultaneous, so you can't say, "Excuse me, but can you repeat that, please?"
It depends. If it's so different and difficult to the point where you can't understand at all, we can't interpret what we don't hear, right? One time I had a colleague ask me, and they were like, what if you don't understand the speaker at all, or you don't know what they're talking about? How do you interpret? My answer is, you cannot. It's like saying, how can I see when my eyes are closed? You can't interpret what you don't hear. I would say, excuse me, and I would be honest in saying the interpreter is having a hard time understanding the speaker. If somebody would please repeat what they're saying. In Arabic, this is very interesting. We have very different dialects. Our dialects, our accents tend to be very different. And so sometimes, as Arabic interpreters, we have to be pretty honest and upfront about what accents we can handle, what dialects we can handle, what dialects we're not that familiar with. I get the gist of what they're saying is not good enough in interpretation. There is this apparently Trump needed an English to English interpreter because he could not understand that Indian person talking to him at the White House. He couldn't
I
understand
saw
his
that.
Indian accent. You saw that? I thought that was hilarious. They had to have an actual English interpreter present because Trump could not understand his English. I thought that was so funny.
And I had never seen that done before either. One thing that I've noticed about native English speakers in the United States is that once they hear someone speaking English in a different tone, a foreign accent, they tend to shut down. They think, "I don't understand what you're saying," because they don't want to actively listen. When President Zelensky of Ukraine came to the White House recently, I have to admit that I was a little upset with him because he's only been speaking English for 4 years. I strongly believe that he would have had an upper hand in the conversation that was very difficult for him if he would have used a Ukrainian interpreter. One of the questions that was asked in sort of a joking, mocking way, he would have had an amazing comeback answer if he would have used an interpreter. Having an interpreter would have allowed him to think about something funny or snarky to answer, and the interpreter would have taken charge of that. They would have been able to interpret that with ease.
I definitely agree. It's not appropriate for politics. It is not for national television, not appropriate. He might be conversational. He probably cannot express himself as well as he can in Russian or Ukrainian, he definitely should have had a professional interpreter present to help him express exactly his ideas. When I work at the clinic, when I have doctors that say, no, I know Spanish, I've taken Spanish for 8 years, but I think it's better to have an interpreter present just because it's a little bit easier for me to express myself in English. I respect that. I respect that a lot, actually. I respect their honesty. It happens where patients are conversational in English. They've been here a number of years, but they're like, you know what? Especially in mental health, they're like, it's just easier for me to express myself in my language to get my point across.
Tell me about how you go about getting conference interpreting jobs. Do you work with agencies? Do you go to a website and look at what's available and sign up? How does that work?
Yeah, there's definitely not a black and white answer I can give. Everybody's situation is so different. Highly depends on your financial circumstances, personal preference. I would try to decide, am I looking for something more freelance or something more stable? It also depends on your financial situation at that moment. For some people, like for me personally, I love working freelance because I can decide, I can decline or accept any assignment. I decide how many days I decide how many hours I want to work that day. If I'm tired, I might not accept as many patients. I love that about freelance. Freelance might be great for somebody who, let's just say, is a mother. I have colleagues who are mothers and they're not available from 8 to 5 every day. So they might accept a couple assignments every day. They want to be there for their children. They have a husband that works, so that works for them financially. I am blessed. I'm never scrambling for assignments with freelance assignments at the clinic all the time. So I am blessed. That anxiety of, oh, when's my next assignment going to come? Especially in translation. They're like, for some people having that 8 to 5, it's a little bit mentally relieving, right?
When you completed a session, whether that be in person, consecutive, or conference interpreting simultaneous, how do you self evaluate your work? And by that, I mean thinking about what your rendering was like and thinking, I could have done this better. How could I have avoided this situation? Tell me about that self evaluation.
I've started bringing in a physical notebook to the clinic. I found it easier than carrying around an iPad. Usually when I'm doing like virtual events, I don't have to carry the iPad physically. In the clinic, I found it easier to actually have a notebook. But again, personal preference. Let's just say there's a word that a doctor said that I struggled with or wasn't sure. Or if I was doubting the way I phrased something, I would jot it down very quickly. After the appointment, while it's fresh in my head, go ahead and look things up. How could I have said this better? What word could I have? So why did I struggle with this? I would go ahead and do that while it's fresh in your mind. I would take advantage of that.
I always carry a notebook with me. It's my security blanket. Sometimes I'm not even writing anything of note. I'm just scribbling while I'm interpreting. If I'm interpreting and I get nervous for whatever reason, maybe there are several people in the room, maybe someone in the room knows Spanish and they're just listening to see if I interpret it correctly, that kind of pressure. I feel safe with my notebook. While I'm in the waiting area, I make use of my time by going through brochures that are displayed and look for words that I don't know. And I write them in my notebook so that I can add them to my glossary. For new or student interpreters that are listening, Razan, how do you handle the situation when you're interpreting consecutively and a word comes up that you just simply don't know? How do you deal with that situation?
It's not a matter of if there is a word you don't know, it's a matter of when. Because especially when you work at clinics all day, they're going to often where a patient got diagnosed with this. There's this word, highly specialized. You're working with, I don't know, a cardiothoracic surgeon, very specialized terms. There are things that are going to come up that you don't know, and that's okay. But I think it's all in how you deal with that situation. A decision has to be made. Sometimes you have to say the interpreter would like a moment to, for accuracy, look up this word, for example. And people, again, oftentimes respect that honesty because they're, oh, okay, yeah, I understand why you wouldn't know that. Yeah, it's a hard one. Most people will appreciate that honesty. I had a patient who was diagnosed with, oh goodness, was it ASD? It was a baby that was diagnosed with a heart condition. And I didn't know the Spanish word exactly. So I said, the interpreter would like a moment to look it up, please, for accuracy. You can't be oh, you have some sort of heart. No, they have to understand their diagnosis, even if they haven't heard of it in their language. They have to know that word. I need that word at that moment. There are times where you can roll with the punches when you don't know a word. For example, I don't know, random word, dishwasher. We're put under that pressure sometimes, even if it's a word not right there when you need it, you don't have time to think. The device that is used to wash dishes, that to clean dishes, understood. Is it the most perfect, beautiful interpretation? No. Does it work? Yeah. So there are moments in the medical field where you might be able to roll with the punches a little bit if you're able to, as long as you're able to express that idea the same way, as long as you're accurate. But there are times where, you do have to do that timeout. I do need to look this up.
Sometimes you do know the word, but it's been a long day. Maybe you've had some complicated sessions, and for some reason or another, you can't remember a word that you are used to interpreting. That happened to me last week. I usually hear shortness of breath coming from the English speaker for me to interpret to a Spanish speaker. In this session, it was the Spanish speaker that said, I have shortness of breath. Maybe it was because it was already 4:30 and I had already been in that session for more than an hour, but I completely flaked. I could not think of how to say shortness of breath from Spanish to English. I do it every day, multiple times a day, but I drew a blank. So embarrassing.
Oh, most definitely. I've done a 12-hour shift in a psych
Oh,
ward.
wow.
I feel that. By the end, you're like, get me out of here, please. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I feel that. I had a patient one time. This was a pediatric appointment, and she was talking about how her daughter had langan. For the life of me, I know what that means. I couldn't think of the English word for the life of me. We say eye boogers. I don't know if you've heard of that term, but that is the only thing I could. I was like, what do we call that in English?
Lagañas. I don't know how to say that in English. And I interpret at the eye clinic at our hospital a lot. And every single time somebody says that they have lagañas in their eye, I'm always caught like a deer in the headlights. I've used sleep, when you wake up and you have sleep in your eyes, but that doesn't come across very well. I usually get a confused look from the provider. And now that you mention it, eye boogers will work for me. I think I'll be using that pretty soon because I don't know what else to say other than the stuff that comes out of your eyes when you have allergies or the stuff that comes out of your eyes when you're sleeping and you wake up and there it is, all nasty and gross. So, yeah, eye boogers will work really well for me. Like you, I speak other languages. I speak Portuguese and Italian, but I don't interpret in them, unlike you. Do you ever have a situation where you say a word, whether you're interpreting in Arabic or in Spanish, and you think, did I say that in Spanish? Did I say that in Arabic?
With multiple languages, it's not like each section of the brain is divided and has each language in it. It's not like they're perfectly in different compartments. They're like bumper cars and they get in each other's way, is what I always say. That is just what happens. Sometimes after speaking in Spanish all day, I come home and someone talks to me and I almost start responding in Spanish. And I'm like, wait, no, wrong language. Yeah, it happens all the time. Yeah, that is a very common occurrence where after a very long day of interpreting, even going to the grocery store after an assignment, you're like, I don't even know what language. I was about to start talking in Arabic to a Trader Joe's cashier. It happens because you're like, wait, you forgot to turn off that interpreting brain. I also, after a simultaneous assignment, everything you hear, you start interpreting simultaneously now in your mind. It's definitely messy.
Because you interpret in two languages, are your assignments language based? Meaning, do you interpret Spanish all day one day? Do you interpret Arabic all day in another day? Or do you get assignments in both languages on the same day?
It depends on my schedule. I work with several agencies. Some days it's all Arabic patients. Some days it's all Spanish patients. Some days it's a mix of both. Some days I have Arabic clients in the morning, Spanish in the afternoon. It depends on my schedule, what I'm assigned that day.
If you were to encounter someone that says, I would like to be a conference interpreter, what tips would you give them?
Besides the question if you're qualified, I would ask them, what area would you like to specialize in? Are you more legal, medical? Make that decision. Make the decision whether or not you want to do freelance, whether you want a more of a stable thing. Do you want to maybe start your own business? You can do that. You can do a lot of cool things. So I would make those decisions up front. It'll make the process with business. Obviously, it's not this neat, nice, pretty, beautiful process. It's very messy. And I think doing that from the get-go, from the very beginning, will make it a lot more smoother, making those decisions. Now, as a community interpreter, it's not, oh, you're never allowed to accept any legal assignment ever. You have to strictly always do cardiology. You don't have to be that strict with it. Obviously, you can, yeah, do school meetings every now and then as long as you qualify again. You can branch out and do that. I would make that decision early on. What area do you want to work with? Do you want to do freelance? Do you not want to do freelance? That's where I would start. If I were to do this over again, that's where I would start.
What equipment did you purchase so that you could start doing conference interpreting online?
I have really good headsets. I would invest in a really good pair. There's this saying in Mexico, what is cheap ends up being really expensive. I've heard interpreting agencies say, oh, you can get like a $10 pair at Walmart. True, but we have to think about quality, right? I would go ahead and invest in a good mic. Some of my colleagues actually have this big fancy setup with like an external camera. Personally, I don't have that, but some of my colleagues do.
Awesome. So my last question, Razan, is what does Razan have going on now? Is there an event, anything that you would like to talk about to promote yourself?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn. It is my name, just Razan Roumany. I do plan on holding webinars in the future sometime, hopefully in the near future.
What would your webinars be about?
It would mostly be about my experience working in child trauma in the mental health field. It would be specific cases, personal experiences.
Razan Roumany, thank you so much for being a guest today in Interpreters and Interrupters.
Pleasure is absolutely mine. Thank you so much for having me.